Pardon me. Just do a quick little test. Sweet. Okay, so the results are in for the voice referendum, and they are emphatic, to say the least. We're going to look at why each side thinks the vote failed, but first, I think we need to lighten the mood a bit. There's bloody massacres and counter-massacres going on in the Middle East. Ukraine's still grinding along under the boot of Putin's new Soviet empire. Indigenous Australians are obviously smarting, but what you might not know is that there is a World Cup going on right now. A cricket World Cup, nonetheless. The 50-over format, the unwanted middle child that sits between the Test match and the T20 format. And last night we finally won a game. Goes Orba. Oh, look at those tats. We beat Sri Lanka, which was our first win in the tournament. We've gone from winning the World Test Championship, the Ashes series in England earlier this year, to literally the bottom of the ladder in this World Cup, losing pretty badly to India and then South Africa. The boys were screaming at each other on the field, dropping catches left and right, until we finally managed to turn it around last night. Some of you may know The Grade Cricketer. It's a podcast run by two legendary blokes from, I don't fucking know, somewhere in Victoria. Higo and Pezza. And before we dive into the real depressing stuff, I think we should hear what they have to say about last night's match.
Tell you what, Pezza, Australia got it done, but my God, Sri Lanka were well in front for a long period in that game. But this game had it all. Australia learning how to catch for once. We had hoardings falling into the stands. We had missed mancads. Warner blowing up at Joel Wilson. Had it all. Just makes you realise how long this tournament goes for. The highs, the lows, the ups, the downs. You think one thing is going to happen and then that will happen forever, and then the opposite happens. People telling me, no, actually Afghanistan were the favourites yesterday to beat England.
Another upset. Afghanistan winning their first World Cup match in 8 years, beating England, hot favourites and former World Cup champions.
Join us here on the channel. Click subscribe for the highs and the lows. It still goes for another 4.5 weeks of these bad boy, the turbulence. If you want the turbulence...
It's been going for nearly 4 weeks already. It's a very long tournament. And if you go 0-3 at the start, you're done. You're out. And thankfully, we managed to pull it back.
Come here every morning, well, most mornings anyway, and enjoy the turbulence, the highs, the lows. Click subscribe on the channel. Australia chased Sri Lanka's 209, 5 down with about 14.5, 15-ish overs left to spare. Pezza, how are you feeling this morning?
Yeah, I've got morning glory. Because for me...
Don't we all, Pezza?
The lid's off.
Okay.
I mean... Look, don't get me wrong.
The bin lid's off.
The signs were not good early in this game.
Yeah.
Burner reviewed terribly. First ball.
Yep.
Oh, first ball. We might actually watch a couple of the highlights they talk about throughout, because they don't have any actual footage of the game.
Stark issues 3 mancad warnings. There's at least 1 missed run out in that.
Yep.
Maxwell offers one of the angriest appeals I've seen.
Yeah.
And Joel Wilson says, wouldn't have thought so. You play for Australia.
No.
And Maxwell was right to appeal. Kusal Pereira's dominating Australia, basically concussed.
Yes.
Travis Head's fast becoming Australia's greatest ever modern player.
Yes.
And he's not even in the team yet.
In his absence.
So crucial.
WhatsApp groups are pinging deluxe. Each little ping and vibration preparing to issue the death knell for Australian cricket as we know it.
Baying for blood.
Mate, Australia was on the edge of a cliff.
Oh.
We had one foot on the plane, as they would say.
Oh my
A cricketing cliff dangling by one ex-English player's well-defined claw.
Yeah.
And then the big boys step up, you know. Then Cummins comes to the party.
Yep.
He had a leading role in getting rid of Justin Langer as the national team's coach, followed shortly by the sponsorship debacle with Alinta Energy. They are not green enough.
Breaks it open. Warner's taking great catches. Zorby's got a Jimmy Jack issue.
Yep.
The fuck is a Jimmy Jack?
But he comes to the party beating blokes on the inside. Someone's obviously stitched up Michael Clark ahead of the game. And
Cummins ain't playing. Oh, he's at the toss.
Joel Wilson's given us decisions.
Yeah.
And then Australia come back into the tournament.
I like it.
Look, some might say... Some might say,
here we go.
This is the illusion of a recovery.
Sure.
Wizened voices, viewers of the game, observers might say, it's the illusion of a recovery.
Never underestimate our ability to cock it completely up in the very next game. We'll be watching with anticipation. Well, I will, and the two other people I know of who know that the World Cup's even on.
Settle down. They've beaten Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Right? I prefer to say, no, here comes Australia. Headies on the next plane out. Watch out, India. The World Cup is ours.
It's coming
It's on!
home.
I've also been seeing a doctor about mood swings.
Yeah. TGC is brought to you by cricket.com. You can download the cricket.com app. Indeed, Pezza, we're from
Not to be confused with Napster.
That's different. That's a different
Said
thing
in a New
entirely.
York accent,
well,
Napster.
Lars, the drummer from Metallica, saw that right off.
Yeah, didn't he?
Much in the same way Australia did last night to Sri Lanka. Well played,
yes!
Higgos. Yeah, the
Go on,
boys
Higgos.
are on.
Segways are
Come
on
on,
now.
boys. Come on, boys.
Let's go, boys. One for Clarky here. Go on, come on. One for Pup. Who do you reckon stitched Clark up? If you haven't caught this, at least in the Australian media.
Now there's a man who's connected to the Australian
That's right.
team.
Hell of a facelift. But if you didn't catch us in the Australian media in the hours before the game, as everyone was sharpening their ex-English player clause, Michael Clark says he'd heard a rumour that Pat Cummins had been dropped from the game.
Yes.
And as soon as we get the coverage...
I don't know how he possibly could have fallen for that. I don't think any team has ever dropped the current captain in the middle of a World Cup.
Of the game when they go to the toss, there's Cummo.
Yeah,
I'm like, is this the first time a captain's tossed the coin without playing?
A little edge for Australia. They've actually got a specialist tosser, which many people say Michael Clark used to be.
Oh, yeah! Come on, boys! Yes! Fucking come on, boys! Let's go! Fuck, everyone's worried around the world now. Here come the Aussies. What with their segways? Here goes.
All right.
All right.
The first thing we're going to talk about, have Australia entered the chat? Was this a performance, Pezza, that eradicated everything we've seen before? I take you back in my little time machine that I have here to
DeLorean.
but 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it was ago, before the third game of the ODI bilateral series
in South Africa, in which we played very poorly.
In South Africa. Australia at that point had won 10 of their last 11 games.
Yeah.
Before this match, they'd lost 7 of the next 8.
Ooh.
The next game is against Pakistan on Friday. Yeah. Travis had his back in. Have Australia entered the chat?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, India, who's watching.
Yeah.
You guys ever seen the Melbourne Cup?
Oh,
you ever seen a horse race?
Yeah.
Tell you what, I don't want to be rounding the bend first. At the first bend, I don't even know how to talk like a horse race. I mean, what? Yeah, 4 or 5 weeks ago or some shit, Australia's #1 in the world, smashing everybody.
That's right.
Now we're the worst team in the world, staging a recovery. You know what I mean? Like we're off to rehab to figure out how to play cricket again.
Yeah.
there's
much.
about 18 or so weeks to go. So you think if it is a horse race, you know, South Africa's out in front looking great.
Looking
fucking
sensational.
Seasoned thoroughbred at the first turn.
Seabiscuit.
Fucking
Seabiscuit out the front.
Seabiscuit and Black Cav. And who's let Salope in this? Rounding the bend, first turn. And Australia's just sitting there in the pack, just probably 2/3 back. Just come up from the rear.
Yeah, that's what we're doing, boys. We're pacing ourselves
And just having a look.
Yeah.
Right? That's what the rest of the world thinks when they see Australia in World Cups, because we've come from the back before, and we've got a great pedigree or whatever. Look, there's an argument this is a bit of an illusion of recovery, but I don't think that's very fun to talk about. I'd prefer to see us sitting exactly where you want to sit in a horse race.
I think the rest of the world see Australia as secretariat, but they don't know that it's actually running towards the glue factory. That's what I was saying, because
they've had some carrots. Obviously, the carrots return. Because I feel like this was a carrotless win.
Okay,
it was like. We absolutely must win if we want to return to the country. And I mean, okay, let's be serious for a second, because I haven't been to this point.
Oh, good luck, boys.
It's a full credit to the boys' win.
Full credit to the boys' win.
They were backs to the wall, edge of the cliff, claw, everything.
It was game two halves as well.
And exactly, and they Cummins clawed them back in, and then the rest of the boys came and they all started sprouting together.
Yes.
Big shower came down.
Yes.
The organic plants started fucking coming together as one.
So let's talk about the actual match itself, I suppose. And the second thing is that Sri Lanka lose 9 for 52. So Sri Lanka were none for 120 after 20-ish overs or something. Nasanka and Kusal Pereira were cruising, albeit with a little bit of assistance there from the old JW, Joe Wilson there.
Oh, that's a hard call. He gave a not out to a very fine. Let's see if we can actually have a look at it. Before we get into Maxi belting it all over the ground. The loudest appeal you've ever seen.
Over top edge, not in control of that shot, and it will run away for a barely scratchy bound. Short, wide, gone. Too fine for the fielder down there. And gleefully.
Adam Zampa bowled
Shots of catch it.
Pretty terrible opening spell. He was all over the shop.
Down the ground, past mid-on, and
bowled his bet as well as he ever has.
6th century. 50s, half. And that'll be 50 for Nasanka. Back. Short, wide, backward point, can't get it. Deep point, can't get it. 4 more.
Josh Hazlewood's also struggling a little bit.
Short again in the air. Can Warner get there? I think he can. He has. And more importantly, he's grabbed it. They need to catch well. He has caught well. Looks like they're going to go short quite a bit, and that one's been pulled behind square for 4. That's 3 or 4 short deliveries in the last 6. Finds the gap. Can Warner get there? He's done a lot of chase. Toe end of the bat.
Yeah, they started strong.
From batting. And I think.
Oh, this is the burning review on the first ball.
What a start, going down, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I can see that it's clearly bat first. If we could go back to the
not good, Camo.
It's gone fine, and it's gone for 4. I think it's attention to detail. He throws the car start for 4. That's been nailed. On the leg stump. Up and over, top edge, not in control of that shot, and it will run away for a barely scratchy bound. Short, wide, gone. Too fine for the fielder down there. Cannot haul that in. And to go with his 6th century. And that'll be 50 for Nasanka. Back-to-back 50s, half.
Anyway, started strong. Maxi might think he got robbed, but I think it was a pretty close call.
With an LBW off Maxwell that was given out and was hitting all three. Anyway, but to that point, Australia were most definitely the 10th best team in the tournament. When that was happening,
yeah. Good reason to sharpen.
Zampa was off the field. He'd bowled 2 overs, I think, for about maybe 20-ish, something like that. He
Went
couldn't
for
land
25
them.
off his first 3.
He ends up being player of the match, and he's spoken quite eloquently after the game about he's injured. Basically, he's injured.
Well, that's all right because I can. Oh wait. There we go.
Inglis had put down a tough catch behind the stumps. Manus had put down a tough catch, but there was all these like little things adding up again where like there are these half chances again that good teams typically hung into one of them.
Ace of base, mate. I saw the sign.
And it was like that's a very good reference. One for the 90s kids. And, after the last troubles of putting down catches in the previous 2 games, you're like, okay, Australia has now not caught a ball since last spring.
Yes.
And you're just
August
thinking,
hands.
at this point, Australia was genuinely the 10th best team. And then there was a rain delay. But before then, Cummins and Zampa take crucial wickets thanks to some excellent catching from Dave Warner.
Yes, crucial Mendes. Yeah.
Almost a cruciate Mendes.
Yeah, indeed. Warner almost did his cruciate Mendes for taking that second
That's what
one.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Australia took all 10 wickets for 84 in 2012. So once that first one went down, the floodgates opened.
84.
If you will. 10 wickets for 84. Got to say, I didn't see that coming.
No.
At none for 128.
I did not see that pack coming.
Yes. But yeah, I guess fortunes are changing when Joel Wilson's helping you out.
Okay, Pez, well, just talking about the collapse generally speaking, I'm going to introduce, of course, this favourite segment. It's time for Cricket.com's Stat Dog.
What the fuck? The fuck?
My regular goat, man.
He's a good little boy.
What the fuck was that? Oh, I'm guessing that's the first time they've heard it too. Oh, wow. This is a little mood lifter. Okay. Now, on to more serious matters. Why did the voice referendum fail? Well, first, let's look at the state by state. This is the yes vote, by the way. 40% New South Wales, 45% Victoria, highest state in the country because fuck Canberra, that's not a real state. Tassie, I've got to go down a bit for Tassie, 40.5%. Yeah, okay. The surprising ones, for me anyway, Northern Territory, 39.5% in support. Queensland, home of, Clive Palmer, One Nation, the Nationals being the major party in the Liberal National Coalition. That's not a surprise at all. WA is a little more surprising at only 36%. And South Australia, Adelaide, fairly progressive place, but again, a very low yes vote, 35%. So the YouTube channel called Australian Agenda. It's put out a video titled, Why Did the Voice Referendum Fail? I'll chuck the links in the description at some stage. But we're going to see why he thinks the voice has failed.
The voice referendum has failed badly, being resoundingly defeated in the vote. This was not necessarily unexpected. After all, most polls were pointing toward this outcome.
Yes, the most recent polls were most certainly pointing towards a defeat, but the further back you go, the more apparent support the voice seemed to have. I think a reason for that may have been the way pollsters were dealing with the question of undecided voters. I think they may have been maybe pulling undecided votes into the yes stats because I think it got as high as 60-70%. Is that Guardian? Wish I still had that window open, but yeah, and then it's decreased over time.
Albeit with some variation across pollster. The interesting thing is, however, that the Yes campaign seemed to have everything going in its favour. It had high-profile support, including from 13 of the largest 20 companies in Australia.
That is true, and it also had quite a bit of private financial support. So did the No campaign from two individuals in particular, but I think on the whole, the Yes campaign had vastly more social acceptance, vastly more support from corporate Australia, if you'd like to call it that. And I think it may have actually worked against it.
It had the backing of sports codes and faith groups and myriad politicians. It had generated many millions of dollars worth of funding, vastly more funding than the No side of the referendum. And it really begs the question, how did it all go so wrong? Why did the Yes campaign fail, even though it looked like the deck was stacked in its favour? The overarching problem to my mind is that the Voice was perceived as bad policy, and it was sold badly.
Perceived as bad policy? Yes, definitely, although I'm not convinced that it is bad policy in practice. Sold badly? Absolutely yes. And for me at least, that is the single biggest reason for the failure of the Yes campaign. Their marketing, their PR strategies were atrocious.
Of course, you might believe that the Voice was good policy. However, a majority of voters seemingly did not, and I'll come back to some of the possible policy failures later on. Now, different voters voted no or yes for different reasons. There isn't a one-size-fits-all reason for why people voted in a particular way. However, we can identify several issues which likely coalesced to give rise to a no victory in the referendum. And if you've got any thoughts about why the Voice failed, well, do let me know that in the comments below. The first issue is that the Yes campaign simply couldn't get its story straight. Its messaging was sloppy. There were mixed messages, and this helped to undermine the Yes camp's own case. Anthony Albanese claimed that the Voice was a modest request, a gracious gesture, an outstretched hand.
Gracious gesture and outstretched hand are not reasons to alter your nation's founding legal document. And I think he needs to take a lot of responsibility for focusing on the feels over the reals.
However, Megan Davis and George Williams also indicated that it was a structural reform that would bring about a redistribution of power. Which is it? Is it a modest request that isn't powerful and is merely an advisory body? Or is it a structural reform? Those are mutually exclusive outcomes.
Not necessarily true. You can have a modest structural reform. G'day, Wixhead. I've been meaning to talk about the Israel-Palestine stuff for a little bit now, but can't really move on to that until we've dealt with the domestic issues. So hang around, we'll have a chat about it.
Anthony Albanese claimed the Voice was not about treaty. However, Linda Burney is recorded on video saying that it is.
In terms of treaty and agreement making, it seems to me that with the establishment of Voice, that is a vehicle to negotiate a national treaty with. So there has to be a body to negotiate a treaty with. And that's why the Voice is so important.
These are mutually exclusive outcomes. Furthermore, voice architects, such as Megan Davis, suggested that without a voice, treaty is vulnerable, implying that voice leads to treaty.
Recall the Guardian article fact-checking the 7 points of misinformation from the No campaign. One of those points included Warren Mundine saying a voice would lead to treaty, a voice would not lead to treaty, while Jacinta Price claimed that it would. They were in contradiction. The Guardian picked up on those, but not on this contradiction from the Yes side.
The Uluru Statement, which Anthony Albanese endorsed in full, suggested that a Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda. That is in the one-page version of the Uluru Statement.
A Makarrata is literally a truth-telling commission, which is part of the Voice Treaty Truth ambition of Indigenous leaders.
The government is already funding money toward a Makarrata commission.
$6 million in budget funding to set up an independent commission for national treaty making. Was not aware of that. That is interesting. So, treaty looks like it's already happening and was already underway regardless of any voice outcome.
Which it seemed to assume would be necessary if the voice were ultimately to succeed. So you're seeing the government talk out of both sides of its mouth. The Yes campaign couldn't get its story straight about what voice meant for treaty, and they kept sending mixed signals. The problem with all of this is that voters stopped trusting the Yes campaign. Voters would see one person say X and another person say Y and contradict that person.
I think the No campaign had similar issues, like we just discussed, but I think when you're the ones aiming for constitutional change, it's much more incumbent on you to get that message dead straight. So I think it may have hurt the Yes campaign far more than it hurt the No campaign.
You would see mixed messages. This undermined goodwill because people felt they were being misled and deceived. It also harmed the assertion that if voters don't know, they should go and find out, because voters would try to find out and they would get mixed information, which is why they ended up being so confused and why they asserted that they didn't know what the voice referendum would entail. The next and somewhat related issue is hectoring, arrogance, and superciliousness.
A key part of a bad PR strategy.
Parts of the Yes campaign came across as rather arrogant and dismissive. Now, certainly there were very good faith Yes campaigners, people who didn't treat No campaigners like mugs. However, the problem is, many high-profile ones appeared to do so, and appeared to feel as if they were above needing to answer questions.
Some of the comments Marsha Langton made throughout the campaign appeared as if she was trying to sync the voice with Middle Australia.
If you want to convince people, you need to explain your side of the case. You need to explain your position, and you need to explain to them why their preconceived notions aren't necessarily correct.
It is absolutely true, and like you said, especially so on the Yes side of the campaign. You can't pull a Hillary Clinton and call everyone who's thinking about a no vote a racist deplorable. It does not work. We've seen it time and time again. And that seemed like it was her strategy.
It isn't good enough to tell them that they're wrong. It isn't good enough to tell them that a particular thing will happen. You need to explain it to them. If people are concerned that the voice is going to be powerful, you can't merely say the voice is advisory. That's not convincing. You need to explain to them why what they know about the voice's powers are not necessarily correct. Now, to my mind, the voice will have power, and hence why I was not convinced by many of the arguments put out by the Yes campaign. You need to explain things, walk people through your logic. You can't just tell them what the outcome will be. Telling them to trust the experts, or that the information is out there.
Trusting the experts is a common theme running through comments on articles in The Guardian. They are very fond of the experts, and many of them note the fact that highly educated electorates, or electorates with very high percentage of Year 12 and university graduates, overwhelmingly supported the voice idea, and they're using that to say, look, we're right. The morons voted no, and the smart people voted yes. And look, there may just be some truth to that. But if that's the way you're going to go about communicating it, it is a massive shot in your own foot. It's just a really, really bad way to bring people in the middle round to your side.
Simply isn't going to do the job. The Yes campaign in so doing appeared to be a little bit condescending. It appeared to embody the worst attributes of progressive identity politics, a seeming self-assured smugness that believed itself to be so evidently correct that it was above question.
Particularly from the celebrity yes, or as friendly Geordies might call them, big yes. That's your Ray Martins. Maybe even a little bit of that from Albo.
Anyone who raised questions was simply told to Google it, or they were accused of spreading misinformation or of listening to misinformation. They were told the information is out there. But where? Who knows? Because if you were to search for that information, you would, like I said, come up against contradictory information from the Yes campaign itself. If you looked for the information, you would find inconsistent and incompatible answers. This arrogance is probably best typified by Marsha Langton's remarks that parts of the No campaign
I had a feeling she might come up.
Were racist or stupid. Now, she was quick to clarify that she wasn't calling no voters racist or stupid, but one does wonder if that's a distinction without a difference.
Distinction without a difference. That's actually a clever way of putting that.
Presumably, she also thinks that people who buy into the No campaign would therefore be supporting racist or stupid rhetoric, which would make them racist or stupid, you would think. Furthermore, Noel Pearson, another high-profile campaigner, had once said that Jacinta...
Noel Pearson used to be fairly socially conservative, from my memory at least.
Price was descending into a redneck vortex. Again, name-calling, which doesn't help the case. Later on during the campaign, he started to try to become warm and fuzzy. However, it was just wheeling up platitudes.
And the warm and fuzzy didn't work anyway.
That simply weren't convincing. There's also been the debacle over censorship, either direct or indirect, which has turned people off the Yes campaign. For example, RMAT Fact Lab attempted to fact-check Peter Credlin over the length of...
Sky News host Peter Credlin has debunked Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's claim the Uluru Statement from the Heart can be read in about 2 minutes after obtaining a lengthy document under Freedom of Information. False information. Outright false. She got 2 documents as part of her Freedom of Information request, I believe. And one, as Baring said, what did he say, was 26, 27 pages? And that was the full statement from the heart. And the rest of the pages were minutes from meetings and so on in the consultation process. I can't believe independent fact checkers claimed that to be just outright false. Maybe he could have gone with needs additional context, but false?
Of the Uluru Statement. However, the fact check itself was rather dubious, and they came under fire for bias. Megan Davis, one of the leading Yes campaigners and the co-chair of the Uluru Dialogue, criticised in an now-deleted tweet ABC for platforming No campaigners.
It's astonishing to me that the ABC Insiders show has Warren Mundine on this morning. He's the leader of the No campaign. And he's Aboriginal. He's a very important voice in the referendum process. Jacinta at NPC, Karen Little on 7:30 report. The muzzle of 4 corners. What the fuck is she talking about? ABC just continually platforms the No campaign.
Strangely, she seemed to accuse the ABC of bias because, quote, it just continually platforms the No campaign, which would be news to anyone who actually watches the ABC.
Amen.
She seemed to realise this was probably a little bit off and not great campaign tactics, hence why she deleted the tweet. But again, it's just part of a broader narrative.
It's too late. Deleting a tweet is an absolute waste of time, particularly if you're a higher echelon Twitter account with, I don't know, tens of thousands of followers. It's too late. It's done. It's out there in the ether. Deleting it only means people know you then took it back. And that really doesn't count as an apology or a rescinding of the opinion. It's done. It's over at that point. You may as well leave it there.
It's made the Yes campaign look censorious, and it undermines trust.
Censorious? That's a big claim. I'd be interested to see how he justifies the censorious claim.
And will be a key contributor to the Yes campaign.
There's been a bit of censorious behaviour in the aftermath, as we'll get to on a Where To From Here article. But I don't know if there was any censorious happenings during the campaign. Maybe there wasn't, I just didn't catch it.
Doing so badly in the referendum. The corporations also only made matters worse. Only 29% of Australians actually wanted corporations to get involved in The Voice. This obviously means that Australians weren't on board with being told how to.
Polling commissioned by the Firm Society Advisory Board. Polling commissioned by the Firm Society Advisory and obtained by Sky News Australia has found that when asked if large companies such as major banks, mining companies, supermarkets and sporting codes should campaign for the Indigenous voice, 29% agreed and 44% disagreed, with 26% unsure. Yeah, it's not a majority in either direction. I think what that says to me is the bulk of people don't really give a shit what they say. I find it's interesting that they donated so much money to the Yes campaign, but getting involved and supporting, I mean, what company doesn't throw a rainbow flag on its Twitter icon?
Vote by CommBank or by Westpac or by ANZ. They simply wanted
very socially progressive companies, I'm sure you'll agree.
The corporations to stay out of it. Company directors were using shareholders' money to go and make a political statement. For the shareholders, this looked rather bad because it looked like the companies were wasting their money. For the employees, it also looked like the company was telling them how to vote. Employees don't really like being controlled by their corporate overlords, with a corporate overlord
telling employees how to vote. So if you're an employee in a large organization, say at, I don't know, McDonald's or a bank, or might be different in a media company, but any big corporation, I don't think most people would assume that their company taking a stance on social issues demands that they then follow that stance. I mean, if he's got any evidence of workplace harassment or discipline or changes or requests on how they behave outside of work, then I could buy that. But otherwise, I think most people these days expect big companies to do the politically easy, socially progressive thing. That's where the money is. That's the only reason they do it. They're not being run by socially progressive, student unionists.
Telling them to vote in a particular way. It made them look controlling. And when you've got one side of the campaign that looks controlling, people are going to vote against that campaign because they're going to vote to try to send a signal to the people that are trying to control them.
I think he might be right there, although I think it's pretty stupid. You're not sending anyone a signal. You're writing the word yes or no. There's no context to your vote, either at a general election or at a referendum. You're not sending anybody any messages. The best course of action, in my humble opinion, is to vote based on the merit of the issue in front of you. Because Mr. AEC vote counter is not going to see your yes or your no and say, they voted yes because they want better Indigenous life expectancy, or because they're not fans of the Black Sovereign movement. That's not how this works. That might be a little more applicable with the preferential voting in general elections, but that's ridiculous in a referendum yes or no question.
The corporations made things worse by getting involved.
I would agree with that.
That was probably not their intention, but it was certainly the outcome. When you put this together, it means that no serious attempt was made to answer no voters' concerns. This then leads me to...
I think that's also true, because in the words of Ray Martin, if you don't know, just go find out what you don't know. It's that easy.
Misinformation. The Yes campaign was plagued by misinformation. Now, while the Yes side likes to complain that misinformation might have been why the voice was failing, they are only correct because it was their own misinformation that was creating the problem.
That is interesting. That's not a claim I've heard anywhere else. I've certainly heard, in fact, I think Albo himself claiming the misinformation from the No campaign as a reason for putting forward new truth in advertising government regulations. So there's a possibility that we're going to have, I guess it would be called a government censor, but really some government body determining what counts as truth and what counts as misinformation. That's a pretty dangerous precedent. So I'll be interested to see what sort of misinformation he's identified on the yes side.
The No campaign certainly did have some confusion in it, but it pales in comparison to the objectively false information that came out from the yes side of the campaign.
Objectively false information?
Oftentimes seemingly from the government itself. Let's take an example. The Yes campaign likes to claim that the Voice would have been merely advisory, and they also like to assert that anyone who claims otherwise is spreading misinformation. However, the Yes campaign was simply wrong. I've covered this in prior videos, but the Voice would have real power, and this is due to an implication of how the Voice would operate. The Voice would have the right to make representations to the government, and as a result, it would have the right to be able to be consulted on various matters.
I see. So making representations to the government and a constitutionally implied right to do that equals consultation, which I suppose that is true. If you don't have that right to make those representations, then you don't have the right. Rather, there is no consultation that then occurs. He's saying the representations equal consultation. I can understand that point of view.
Because the right to make representations implies a practical right to be able to make those representations, which implies consultation. There would be literally no other constitutionally enshrined body that has that same right.
True, but not inherently a bad thing.
This means the government would only be compelled to go and consult with and seek representations from the Voice. No other party, no other countervailing views. Furthermore, by having that right to be consulted and to make representations, it enables the Voice to engage in vexatious litigation to achieve collateral purposes, which Thomas Mayo had addressed.
Potentially true, and yes, some of Thomas Mayo's public utterances did seem to imply that, but that's not a guaranteed outcome, and I think legislatively the government could take steps to address that sort of vexatious litigation risk, as he puts it.
And talked about doing. It therefore means the Voice would have real power, and it would also not necessarily be another entity to offset the viewpoints being put forth by the Voice, and therefore the Voice could control the narrative. That is implicit, albeit slightly indirect, power that the Voice would wield.
Implicit ability to control the narrative. Not sure I agree with that. Control the narrative on policies relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, or controlling the narrative of the government? Because I don't think that's a realistic view.
This is in addition to all of the concerns that Nicholas Aroni made about the Voice's representations expanding Parliament's legislative ability. Therefore, you end up with a rather powerful Voice body. Its influence is clear. However...
Yes, but that is by design, like it's supposed to. If it doesn't have the ability to, I guess, as he would say, demand that consultation, or if that consultation is not an implicit part of the policy-making process affecting Indigenous peoples, then there's really no point to it. That's an important part of what makes it work, what makes it even worth considering in the first place.
The Yes campaign and Anthony Albanese kept saying that it was merely advisory, which to my mind was outright misinformation. The Yes campaign also claims that any talk linking Voice to treaty is misinformation. However, they are clearly incorrect, because Linda Burney, the Indigenous Affairs Minister...
Albo links them on this shirt And no, it's not good enough to claim it's concert merch. The PM is responsible for the slogan he wears. Boys Treaty Truth. Midnight. Oh, of course it's a midnight oil shirt. Elbow.
Has done this herself. She linked them. People like Megan Davis and George Williams have linked them. The Uluru Statement links them. It is not misinformation to link the Voice.
Yeah, but linked does not imply successive procedural agendas. Linked doesn't mean sequential and guaranteed. Linked simply means the discussion, it could mean as little as this discussion informs the next discussion on treaty and Makarrata. It doesn't necessarily mean they're linked objectives as part of this whole referendum process.
To treaty, because yes campaigners themselves have done it.
There's a lot of Aboriginal flags in this video.
And people are simply quoting back yes campaigners and what they have said. The yes campaigners also put out talking points about how the Voice would be comprised. For example, equal representation from men and women, or representation from various locations. Things.
6 important facts about the Voice. Independent from the government. Provide advice to Parliament and the government. An elected body drawn from local communities. Remote area representation. Key point. Equal numbers of women and men. Less key. Be interested to see how they propose to make that happen if it's an elective process. Will not run programs or handle any funding. That might be a little contentious given I forget her name. She linked it to the treaty process. If the Voice is the body that the treaties are negotiated with, or represents the bodies that the treaties are negotiated with, then I think that kind of implies, not necessarily programs or funding, but it implies a little bit more than you don't know now you know. Yeah, a little bit more than what they're making it seem here.
That nature. However, that again is false information. It is objectively verifiably false.
Objectively verifiably false. Strong statement.
Because any of those things, such as the composition of the Voice, could only be determined by legislation. And this has 2 implications.
Hey guys, I'm not onto the Israel-Palestine stuff yet. That comes after the Aussie issues, like the cricket and the referendum. But I will get there.
First, the government simply has failed to provide that legislation. It has willfully not provided legislation.
Feel free to chat about it, though. Be interested to see where you guys stand.
Therefore, we don't know what the government intends for the composition of the Voice. Second, that legislation could change over time. Therefore, even if the government presently intends to do X, it could decide to do Y in the future, potentially next year or even next month. There would be no guarantee the Voice would be comprised in a particular manner. And therefore, going around putting out talking points saying there'll be equal representation of men and women on the Voice, that's objectively incorrect. This is like telling you that the grass is blue, and when you know it's green and point this out, you're accused of disinformation. It is clearly disingenuous. It is linguistic gaslighting.
Linguistic gaslighting. What a phrase.
Became frustrated with this. I became frustrated with this because it made the Yes camp look dishonest and was likely one of the reasons people were really turning on the Yes camp.
The Yes camp looking dishonest. I think that wasn't really an issue for me because I assume both camps are going to be presenting this information in ways favourable to their desired outcomes. So I guess I kind of assume both sides to be a little dishonest from the get-go, and that's why you need to examine both sides so thoroughly.
This then leads me to the issue of vagueness and complacency about the nature of the Voice. There was the common refrain of details, give us details. Now this was quite commonly asserted as a problem in a lot of the polling. People craved information about the Voice and how it would function. The government seemingly thought it was a good idea to not put out any details at all.
Big stuff up there. Could have put forward draft legislation, on what the voice would have been, but took a small target approach. Didn't want to give too much detail, didn't want to repeat the Republic referendum of the 90s. And it did not pay off. The information could have been very, very valuable. Could have linked to some of those examples I talked about last time.
They seemingly wanted to take a small target approach and feared that any legislation would be torn apart if they put it up. Now, to some extent, I have some sympathy for the government's argument here. Of course, legislation can change at any point after the referendum. So it isn't necessarily apt to look at the legislation itself. Rather, we should focus on the Constitution.
What's going on here? Is this video cut?
Constitutional provisions. But that then gives rise to the underlying problem, which is that the amendment text was badly framed. It was so broad and to some extent so vague that there were myriad possible pieces of legislation that could come into being. And this made people concerned. So the text in the amendment should have been a lot tighter, because the government's legislative ability is under the Constitution. And if the Constitution gives power, the Parliament can't go and take it away. The government took a maximalist approach to the voice, but in so doing, it created a voice body that would be so broad and so far-reaching that it was unpalatable to the general population. This then leads me to the issue that the voice was also bad policy. Slick marketing was never going to resolve this. The Yes campaign liked to say, if you don't know...
No, slick marketing would not have resolved that, but it could have made a pretty significant difference.
Find out. Well, people did find...
Because not everyone thinks it's bad policy.
...out, and they voted no. So let's briefly look at some of these policy failures. Well, the first one, like I've indicated, is the voice would be a powerful entity. It would have the ability to make representations to the government, and also therefore the implicit right to be consulted on myriad matters. Coupled with this is the right to litigate if they felt they weren't consulted or if they alleged they were ignored. That litigation right can be used vexatiously, like people like Thomas Mayo have suggested. Therefore, you end up with a rather powerful voice body that does in fact have real power that it can operationalize. It would also be the only constitutionally enshrined body that would be able to make those representations, which would enable it to control the narrative. People also saw this as somewhat discriminatory, because it would appear to give power to only one subset of Australians. This is in addition to the concerns I mentioned before from Nicola Cerrone, that the voice's representations could then enable the Parliament to legislate on those representations, thereby expanding Parliament's inherent legislative.
Yes, okay. But the representations are on proposals the government already has in train, so it doesn't necessarily imply the voice is putting forward its own legislation. I don't think that's the case.
Ability into areas where it did not heretofore have that legislative authority. This therefore would give significant power to a voice, significant power that accrues to one subset of the population. This therefore makes the voice look discriminatory, which is the type of policy that was always going to have a major problem succeeding. The policy also didn't have clear support from all Indigenous Australians.
No policy has 100% support in any group, and I wouldn't have expected the voice to have 100% support among Indigenous Australians. It did have very high support among Indigenous Australians, as high as 80% at one point, although I think the final result was a bit closer to, I want to say 60%. Let's look this up, actually. Voice support Indigenous Australians. Indigenous Desert Alliance, Reconciliation Australia, New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, all support. Figures. 26th of April, a majority support. 1st of August, Albo claims between 80 and 90%. I'd take that with a big grain of salt. I swear I saw some actual figures on this recently.
The two leading no campaigners, Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, are Indigenous, and this therefore really blew a hole in the argument that no campaigners were racist or that all Indigenous Australians wanted the voice, when the two leading no campaigners are Indigenous.
And the Yes campaign had said some pretty horrible things about, tokens and so on, about these two particularly. But there's always going to be Indigenous people that did not support it.
There was a poll floating around.
Let's see if I can find those figures for you.
That 80% of Indigenous Australians wanted the voice, but that was a very old poll on a small sample. By contrast, more recent polls suggest that that number is much lower. If that 80% were ever accurate, it certainly wasn't by the time the referendum occurred. And therefore, it wasn't actually even clear that the voice would achieve what it set out to achieve.
As I've said before, of course, there are no guarantees. But given the poor government decision-making in this area for a very long time, I don't think that's enough of a reason not to at least try it as a decision-informing model. Like, you really want a way to develop better data that goes into government decision-making in this particular area. For example, NT intervention had policies linking family welfare payments to school attendance. And the result of that was an actual increase in school absences in the Aboriginal community and increased family discord, they call it. I didn't read family violence, but family discord. So the policy just made things worse, even though it was intended to encourage things like school attendance.
Concerns from some Indigenous Australians that the voice would be full of inner city elites, and those inner city elites would simply trample over more regional areas. It would create a facade they were being listened to when in fact they weren't being. There were also broader policy events and potentially own goals that played into the bad result for the voice. For example, in Western Australia...
Just to answer your question, as of 2021 census, just under 1 million Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, 1/3 under 15 years of age, which tells you that they have low life expectancy, which is a problem, a big problem. Median age of 24 years, very young compared to other groups, compared to the rest of the country. 3.8% of the total Australian population. Most, I believe, do live in cities, but a substantial portion, there's just too much here to go through now, a substantial portion live in very remote communities, basically right in the outback.
There were the cultural heritage laws, which were incredibly unpopular, to the extent the government was forced to promise to repeal those laws and raised fears those might be pursued at the federal level. Those concerns spread out of WA into the broader Australian electorate.
WA cultural heritage laws. Obviously, WA barely counts as part of Australia. They didn't sign the referendum to create Australia initially. They were going to do their own thing, and they have a very independent culture from the rest of Australia. I'm Victorian, real Australian. I'm just kidding. But I don't know much about WA, despite having lived there for a few years in my childhood. 1972 is calling repealing the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act. 2021. Just 5 weeks after its commencement, the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act has been repealed. Will be replaced with an amended version of Aboriginal Heritage Act, very legislation it was intended to overhaul. Bodes further research.
In Queensland, the government was pursuing a treaty, and that was seemingly very unpopular with, again, the electorate. In New South Wales and myriad other areas, there were concerns about native title, potentially over prime areas of real estate. And
concerns that I believe were unfounded. At least I haven't seen evidence contrary to that, apart from a few wacky flyers someone's printed out on an A4 and handed out at the local Bunnings sausage sizzle or something.
And the concern that that might be turbocharged if the voice referendum were to ultimately succeed. All of these factors made people concerned, and whether or not those concerns were well-founded, people became even more hungry for details and even more in need of reassurances.
Details that never came.
And those reassurances simply weren't forthcoming in a persuasive way. We should also acknowledge the contributions of Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine and all of the other No campaign volunteers. Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine were able to clearly and precisely take apart the problems with the referendum and with the amendment text.
Yes, Jacinta Price also said some pretty wacky things at times, particularly regarding colonisation that I think many of her Aboriginal brothers and sisters would disagree with. Little inflammatory, but to each their own.
They were able to articulate the problems with the voice. They stood in stark contrast to people like Anthony Albanese or Noel Pearson, who often spoke in emotional platitudes, which simply weren't convincing.
Again, emotional platitudes are not convincing. Feel good, do the right thing, extend your hand to Aboriginal Australia. You're talking about the Constitution here. You can't just give people feel-good stuff and then tell them if they vote no, they're a basket of deplorables.
Because they didn't answer people's questions and they weren't precise and direct enough. The No campaign did a lot right, and this enabled them to capitalise on all of the mistakes that the Yes campaign made. The Voice therefore failed. The Voice failed because it was a bad policy that was marketed badly. The Yes campaign had disproportionately higher resources, and it still failed. It frittered away millions of dollars. The only silver lining, if there is one, is that Australia has now sent a clear sign that bullying, hectoring, or duplicitous marketing simply won't get a political campaign across the line. The
That's a big statement as well. I think hectoring and bullying will be a key part of many future elections. I think it more accurately sends a message that feeling good is not a reason to change your nation's founding legal document. There's a reason it's incredibly difficult. There's a reason you need 4 states and a majority of the population saying yes. Most of the referendums we've held have failed.
Government can't go around gaslighting the populace, and if it tries to do so,
he loves that gaslighting word as well.
It's going to fail. That at least is a silver lining. But if you've got any thoughts about why the Voice referendum failed, do let me know that in the comments below.
Okay. So, bad policy communicated poorly, according to Australian Agenda. Now, we're going to read an article by The Guardian's Indigenous Affairs correspondent, Indigenous Lorena Allam. What's her role? She's the Indigenous editor. Lorena Allam, descended from the Gamilarey and Yawalaray nations of northwest New South Wales, and is the Guardian's Indigenous Affairs editor. Okay. Rejecting the Voice shows Australia is still in denial its history of forgetting a festering wrong. Scathing critique, very much in contrast to Australian Agenda here. The referendum became, by proxy, a vote on Indigenous people's right to exist in our own land. And here we go with the feels again. Imagine, just try how that feels today. I don't think anyone cares how anyone feels anymore. I think we stopped caring how people feel around about the time Donald Trump got elected in the US. It's about hard results on the ground now, and nothing else. Very realpolitik. Australia has overwhelmingly voted not to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. Yes, but by recognising them specifically with a voice mechanism, and the nation has changed forever. Plenty will be said in coming days about the campaign and how it all went down, much of it by non-Indigenous people who already have power. If I can get some highlights going. Yeah. Influence and access to the media to prosecute their arguments. In that way, the country will be much the same as it was last week, a place where the voices of First Nations people are drowned out, talked over, and misrepresented in a national conversation that is forever about us without us. Not true. You have the same access to Parliament as everyone else. I absolutely agree that it is not working, and I think there's merit in additional mechanisms, but it is absolutely not without you. We're all Australians. It'll take us months and years to grasp the full impact, but it's already blindingly clear that the result has been deeply hurtful for First Nations people, regardless of how we voted. We entered this campaign with apprehension. It felt risky to put faith in the Australian people, most of whom have never met an Aboriginal person. I believe that is true, and mostly remain unaware of our history and cultures. My adult child, standing in a long line to vote on Saturday, was overwhelmed with sadness. Feelings. Why are all these people deciding whether we belong or not? They asked. That's not what we were deciding. Other friends and family were taking it in turns to accompany elders to and from voting booths, making sure they were not left alone in the queue. Mob have been checking in on each other in texts, phone calls, group chats, Facebook. The love and solidarity on such a challenging day has been uplifting. When bipartisanship, which had long been a feature of the push for Indigenous constitutional recognition, died in November last year, even before the question was settled, the debate went downhill fast. It was neither respectful nor informed. It was vitriolic, mean-spirited, full of misinformation, driven by racism, petty grievances, and conspiracy theories based on fear and ignorance. Whoa. What a sentence. The referendum became by proxy a vote on Indigenous people's right to exist in our own land, and our fellow Australians voted to reject us. Imagine, just try, how that feels today. This is the result Yes campaigners did not want to imagine as they frantically crisscrossed the country in the final weeks, trying to stave off the inevitable, running on hope and conviction. Their campaign stats were quite something. More than 70,000 volunteers knocked on 320,000 doors and made more than 1 million phone calls. That's impressive. That's a good campaign base that could be harnessed in the future. In the final week, they made an average of 30,000 calls a night. Noel Pearson calculated he had spoken at 129 forums since July. This week, he crossed 3 time zones in 24 hours. Thomas Mayo has been on the road for 260 days this year alone. Nobody could question their faith in the cause. True. The Yes campaign director, Dean Parkin, said it was the biggest volunteer army in Australian history, the creation of a base of support for Indigenous people. That volunteer army must not disband, he said. Keep supporting First Nations people, keep showing up, tackle racism when and where you see it. Keep being an ally. We will need you more than ever. I'm glad they have recognised what they have here. On ABC on Friday night, the former Indigenous Affairs Minister and Yamachi man Ken Wyatt urged no voters to also stay involved, saying that turning down the voice because they didn't think it would be effective should be accompanied by a commitment to do more in support of Aboriginal people. Absolutely true. If they cared that much, he argued, they should do something about it. That is true. The no politicians in Canberra, particularly Peter Dutton, it's incumbent on him now to make sure something concrete comes out of this whole process and that he's not just the bomb chucker from the sidelines. Learning the nation's history would be a good first step. The big winners of this campaign are racism and misinformation. That's disappointing. Before his term expired, the Race Commissioner Chin Tan called racism a tentacled monster that feels impossible to slay, and its venomous nature seems to have only mutated in recent times. That is another hell of a sentence. Nice turn of phrase. Tan said his greatest fears were realised, and the debate was allowed to degenerate into one about race. The Yes campaigners have argued that it isn't about race, it's about culture. But I think there's a pretty significant link between Aboriginal people culturally and Aboriginal people genetically. Wait, is that correct? The culture and the race are linked to a degree in this case. Wait, no, I need to meditate on that a little more. I'm not sure if I stand by that. Degenerate into one about race. I think race was certainly always going to play a part. Australia urgently needs a national anti-racism framework and bipartisan response to racism, Tan said. We cannot afford to delay. This monster has no place in our society. It not only harms First Nations peoples, whose continued collective suffering should be enough of an impetus to inspire change, but for far too many Australians across a multitude of backgrounds, racial discrimination remains a daily occurrence. For First Nations journalists, the campaign has been grueling. I have no doubt about that. Is she Aboriginal? Wow. We have been unavoidably exposed on a daily basis to some of the worst depictions of our people. We have received threats and racist hate each time we hit publish on a story. We have worried about fairly representing the wide views of our communities while trying to call out lies and misinformation when they arose. This was like a game of whack-a-mole. No sooner had we debunked one myth than another took its place. This is effectively calling pretty much everything on the no side misinformation. We spent a lot of time contemplating what might come from a no vote, and none of it felt good. Feelings again. We lived with a sense of dread for weeks, if not months, but here we all are, and somehow we must find a way to move forward as a nation. Anthony Albanese was fond of saying during the campaign, if not now, then when? On Saturday night, he got an answer. Never. I'm not sure I buy that at all. There won't be another referendum anytime soon to recognise Indigenous people in the nation's birth certificate. But that doesn't mean there can't be a voice that has real impact and solves actual policy issues by connecting pretty much disenfranchised Aboriginal communities with the Parliament in Canberra. So, never. I don't believe that. There won't be another referendum anytime soon to recognise Indigenous people in the nation's birth certificate, and it was voted down by the people who were never given an honest alternative plan. That is also true. No ideas, no vision, no explanation of how the status quo is going to materially improve Aboriginal lives. It won't. I think, by definition, the status quo will not materially improve Aboriginal lives. The key is changing the status quo in a way that doesn't involve a constitutionally recognised voice to Parliament. I don't believe that's impossible. The question now is, if not this, then what? Very good question. What is the future of the rest of the Uluru Statement, particularly treaty-making and truth-telling? That would be the Makarrata Commission that they've been referring to. I think truth-telling is a very Orwellian statement. Again, they need better PR, the yes side, if they're going to roll on with this sort of stuff. Albo certainly needs better PR. Albanese has said his government is committed to it in full. Truth-telling will be the key to leading us to healing and understanding. We need to tell and listen to the truth of our nation's history now. The referendum is behind us. It is still there, a festering wrong still to be righted. True. Until we face it, it will be impossible to convince Australians that we deserve a voice to Parliament or anything else. As the author Melissa Lukashenko put it, white Australia doesn't want to give blackfellas anything, even when it's nothing. This denial, this history of forgetting, is the problem Australia still has to overcome. Sunday is a day of reflection, so let's reflect on the commitment by all of the First Nations advocates in our history who have given their entire lives to the betterment of their people. There have been First Nations advocate amongst white Australia as well. Some campaigners will be feeling heartbroken today, in despair over a result they fought so hard to avert. I pay my respects to them all. They have given it everything. We wish for your sake the result had been different, that you could rest knowing that you had made things better for your children, so they wouldn't have to struggle and go without like you did. We could ask for no more. This whole thing may be part of a process that makes things better for your children. So I would not despair entirely. But also know that we will not let this drag us down. Like every other time we've been kicked to the curb by the colony, we will get up, we will show up, and we will fight on. And I think that possibly highlights another issue, that last little sentence. Being kicked to the curb by the colony. The colony has not existed since 1900. If you're being kicked to the curb now, you're being kicked to the curb by us, by Australians. And that's something we need to work on for sure. But a whole lot of people were kicked to the curb by the British Empire. A whole lot of people. We will get up, we will show up, and we will fight on. So that is in diametrical opposition to the video we just watched. Obviously taking it very personally. Indigenous Affairs Editor Lorena Allam. Now we'll move on to the Age. And misleading ads. Misinformation was a very common theme here. Where was that sentence? Vitriolic, mean-spirited, full of misinformation, driven by racism, petty grievances, and conspiracy theories based on fear and ignorance. I think if that's all you see people that voted no as, I think you may have an issue as well, because that is absolutely not the case. If anything was vitriolic and mean-spirited, I believe that was a pretty sizable minority. And now there is a very real danger in labelling anything that supported the No campaign as misinformation. Prime Minister details misleading ad used in Voice campaign. Have a look where this is going. The Prime Minister says the government is starting a process to look at false and misleading political advertising, citing one example of a deceptive ad that ran during the referendum campaign. Obviously an example on the no side, although you could absolutely say there were deceptive ads on the yes side as well. Also, I'm not sure I'd call this an ad. Independent MP for Warringah, Zali Steggall, has asked whether the government would support her bill or introduce its own to protect Australians from misleading or deceptive political advertising following a Bruising Voice campaign. There is currently no requirement for truth in electoral advertising, and the Australian Electoral Commission only has powers over ads that are deceptive concerning casting votes. Anthony Albanese said this was a concern because in some cases those ads could be dangerous. I'm not sure I'd agree with that. He cited a specific example, which was an image that had the Star of David across 8 Australians' faces, including Yes campaigner Thomas Mayo, businessman Anthony Pratt, and Attorney General Mark Dreyfus. I believe that is the brochure, or more accurately, random sheet of paper printed out by some neo-Nazi somewhere who sees Jewish conspiracies everywhere he looks. And I believe a couple of Liberals got a Star of David as well. I think the only one missing a Star of David in that flyer was poor old Noel Pearson. He didn't get a Star of David. He was left out in the cold, but still claimed to be under the boot. I don't think anyone takes anything like that seriously. I'm going to try and pull it up or find it in the Friendly Geordies video so we can actually look at what he's talking about here. The Voice.
Well, just in case you've been living under a rock, I'm guessing that rock is at Uluru, as we're having a referendum on, is the fifth thinking big picture. I don't think these anti-globalist types are voting no by the...
Every aspect of the Aboriginal voice to Parliament is Jewish. This doesn't even look like it was ever printed out. This is like something out of the Christchurch Guys manifesto. This is not stuff that anyone takes seriously. Julian Lisa, Shadow Attorney General. There's Thomas Mayo, Mark Dreyfus, Anthony Pratt. If there had not been a Ron Castan, there would not have been a Mabo. Jeff Clark, the rapist who ran the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission until his corruption got so bad they shut it down. That's a pretty good reason right there not to include a voice in the Constitution. But this one random ad that ran during the campaign, as Albo is claiming, is now providing a basis for the government to determine what constitutes the truth. And I can't imagine much that is more dangerous than that. Albanese quoted one ad. I would not call that an ad by any stretch of the imagination. All of the major creators, financiers, and supporters of the Voice to Parliament are Jewish. Ask yourself why 0.38% of Australia's population is using 3% as a battering ram against the rest of the country. Like, the whole thing is just ridiculous, stretch after stretch after stretch. He said there were a number of ads along those lines. Everyone in this parliament would find that totally abhorrent, he said. Now, when it comes to the challenge that we have of dealing with this, it is complex. Oh, I'm glad you recognise that you do not want to interfere with freedom of expression. But at the same time, you want to make sure that elections can be held and democratic processes can be held in an appropriate way. The Minister is undertaking appropriate processes to deal with that, and I look forward to working with them, with the member for Warringah. So they're already making steps to deal with the issue of misleading advertising. And it's not going to be through education campaigns. It's going to be through something akin to a government censor. And if I can find some of the comments in these Guardian articles, have a look at how many of them claim the only reason people voted no was because of disinformation. How old is this article first? I might as well read the whole thing. The voices of division will keep winning unless we learn these hard lessons from the referendum. Yes, reflected the rich breadth of Australia's civic institutions, but they were no match for the fear and division that gravitated around no. It's like they can't even imagine a logical, rational, bullshitless reason that you might not want to support including the voice in the Constitution. It's not even on their radar. Saturday's referendum result is not just a devastating rejection of the generous invitation. Interesting way to phrase a campaign to change the Constitution from First Nation people to walk forward in history. It is also a telling repudiation of civil society. Consider this. Every faith, every major sporting organisation, every trade union, literally hundreds of NGOs and not-for-profits, universities, major corporations and industry associations all endorsed a yes vote on the weekend. Have a think about that for a second. You've got basically every institution in your democratic society telling you to vote yes. It might speak to the prevalence of yes of yes support in the community, but much more likely, we'll just leave that there. Every single one, not every single one, but the vast majority all endorsed a yes vote and still got absolutely overturned. What was the total figure? 39% voted yes, despite all of this. Maybe that reflects something about what you were telling people when you were telling them to vote yes. Maybe it's not just Peter Dutton, because Peter Dutton was always going to say no. He's Peter fucking Dutton. He's the conservative ex-cop from Queensland who says no to everything. You knew that was baked in to the process. Can't really blame it on him forever. At some point, the people who not campaign for yes, but the people who guided the PR strategy need to take a whole lot of responsibility. Yes reflected the rich breadth of Australia's civic institutions, but their combined reach and resources were no match for the fear and division whipped up by the ragtag band of political grifters that gravitated around no. You can't even imagine any respectable legal mind or political advocate even thinking about no. Just a ragtag band of political grifters. Grifters also implying that they don't believe that no is the right decision. They're really just yes supporters who think, what, there's a bit of money in voting no? Because most of the money went with the yes campaign. This combined commitment not only failed to move the needle, it actually played into one of the more devastating lies of the No campaign, that a grassroots-driven process to share power was actually an elite conspiracy to centralise it. I don't know if that formed an official part of the No campaign. While First Nations leaders regroup, it is incumbent on non-Indigenous organisations committed to reconciliation and justice to reflect on our contribution to this shared national failure with curiosity and humility, of which you have so far shown absolutely none. Collectively, we failed to generate the empathy and clarity, again, with the empathy, the feelings, the feel-good bullshit. Give a few examples that would have worked on the ground. That would have been a start. The empathy and clarity that was required to reassure the majority of non-Indigenous Australians that it was okay to share a modicum of power with those with the least. I agree with that. For all the lies in this campaign, there's one truth we can't ignore. The algorithms of division are strong and becoming stronger while our civic institutions are under attack and becoming weaker. Using them to berate 60% of the country is not going to start strengthening them. As this week's Guardian Essential report shows, people who are members of organisations were significantly more likely to support the voice than their fellow Australians. There just aren't enough of them. Well, what, are you going to create an organisation for every person in Australia? That's not a realistic... Maybe that's not what that can't be what he's suggesting. That's ridiculous. Members of a sporting club, 48% yes, 45% no. Member of a religious institution, 51% yes, 41% no. This is interesting. I haven't seen these figures yet. Member of a community organisation, 58% yes, 34% no. Member of a union, a little more expected, 67% yes, 25% no. Not a member of any, 32% yes, 57% no. Maybe that's a reflection of disengagement with the political process, or maybe that's a reflection that people were much more keen to support the idea before we actually got to the polls. Our findings show that if the referendum had only been held among the 43... If we only held a referendum among people that support it, the referendum would have been successful. What a stupid fucking point. What a ridiculous thing to even include in your final draft here, mate. If the referendum had only been held among the 43% of respondents who say they join things, then it would have been successful. Colour me shocked. A standout was the union movement, which saw more than 2/3 of its members accept the invitation. But too few organisations leveraged this moral authority to build a broader community consensus. They sat around waiting for the campaign cavalry to arrive, rather than realising that they were the cavalry. Too many organisations thought it enough to issue a media release of support or put their logo on an advertisement no one would ever read, or simply embed their commitment in the daily flow of business as usual internal communications. That's exactly what I said before. They're always willing to put a rainbow flag in the logo on Twitter. Doing things on the ground? Yeah, good luck. Endorsement should have been the beginning of an organisation's commitment, taking the time to activate internal and external networks to inoculate staff, members and customers from the disinformation that was infecting their face. So it's not even just misinformation anymore. It's disinformation that you need to be inoculated against if you were even considering voting no. That's an Orwellian paragraph, that one. Too many organisations viewed their support through a risk matrix that focused more on not offending people by telling them what to think. What a great idea! Rather than actively engaging them with the context and content they were crying out for. The risk of failure was not a factor. Citation needed. This reticence was actively fueled by the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, that while not prosecuting the free speech stifling agenda of its former chair and no campaign acolyte Gary Johns, still sent out a string of correspondence that had a chilling effect on active campaigning. A chilling effect on active campaigning. I wonder what this author thinks a truth in advertising department or bureaucracy, what sort of effect that will have on active campaigning? Or does it only matter if it affects the side that you support? If they did get moving, too many organisations were too reliant for their engagement on the very same exploitative digital platforms that were dividing, exciting, and discombobulating the public. Diving into this civic cesspit was never going to clear the air. A proof point of failure is that members of these organisations were more likely to have been trapped by the No campaign's tropes of division and special rights than the general electorate. Members of these organisations and the general electorate. Interesting. One moment. Are we still good? Yes, we are still good. Most important reasons for voting no amongst voters. I would bet my life on the fact that the author considers there to be literally no valid reason for voting no, with the way he's basically called these points disinformation. It will divide Australia in the Constitution on the basis of race. If you replace that word with culture, I think you have more standing. Total 41% Union member, 51%. There is not enough detail, only 27%. That's interesting. Won't make a real difference to the lives. That's an assertion, and I don't think that's a particularly great reason to vote no. 19%. Will give Indigenous Australians rights and privileges that other Australians don't have. Yeah, but other Australians don't need that particular right to put their case to the government in the way that some of these Indigenous communities, the particularly remote ones, do. So I don't think that's a particularly great reason to vote no either. That's not to say there aren't good reasons to vote no. These findings suggest that the No campaign's choice message was the campaign's winning frame. Organisations professing national unity were impotent in the face of this angry barrage. The cost of this failure is higher than just the immediate failure of of reconciliation. It is a harbinger of fundamental realignment with the way politics will be prosecuted in this country. Wonder where this guy sits on the political spectrum. The untethered right will be emboldened by this win, looking for more things to drive their anger. A miserable opposition becoming a willing handmaiden to this cynical enterprise. They will keep dumbing down complexity. What do you think focusing on feels is, if not dumbing down complexity? And turning people against the very institutions whose health should be an expression of our collective cohesion. It is an expression of our collective cohesion, and it's not great. It's not particularly healthy. That's not on anyone else. That's on these institutions. As they do, those same institutions will become even weaker, and the resentment of the disengaged will only grow. Resentment of the disengaged. I like that sentence. This is bigger than Australia. No, it's not. It is quite literally not. Around the world, the power of institutions has waned. True. First under the concerted attack of global capital, and now under the force of platform models that turn every user into a community of one. These are the conditions for Trumpian populism. I was wondering when Trump was going to come into it. Trumpian populism to take root and thrive as it has elsewhere around the world. I don't think that's true for Australia pretty much at all. What the great economist J.K. Galbraith first described as the countervailing power of civil society, essential for giving citizens a genuine voice in their democracy, and not just the performance of one, becomes a bulwark against this brand of populism. I also don't think populism is inherently bad. I think it has been bad more often than not. But I don't think it is inherently or endemically bad. The only silver lining is after the voice vote, we now know what they are doing, and if we don't learn from this failure, these voices of division and discord will keep winning. We can choose to counter... Oh, he's pulled it back from disinformation. We can choose to counter misinformation with more than hand-wringing and calls for light touch regulation. Got to go in with that heavy hand. We need to build our own reality-based ecosystem. We can choose to deploy the algorithms to run our own reactionary negative campaigns, or find new grassroots ways of pursuing progressive change, harnessing the passion of individuals. I thought individuals were bad. Communities of one. Like the 50,000 who volunteered for yes into a standing army of citizens. True, that'll be a test. And we can recognise that a vibrant civil society choosing to work together with real purpose is a critical part of our social fabric that should be supported and nurtured by government as a public asset rather than transactionally managed as an ongoing irritant. We must make these choices as a matter of urgency or surrender ourselves to the ongoing cycle of division that has already cruelled the aspirations of First Nations people and now threatens to infect the rest of our body politic. This is the political challenge of our time, one that will determine our immediate futures on everything we care about, from climate to geopolitics to inequality to AI to the very fabric of our democracy. Another good sentence. Peter Lewis, Executive Director of Essential. It's a polling company. It's a very left-wing polling company, if this is anything to go by. But fair enough. So we've looked at why some of the no supporters think the referendum failed. Bad policy communicated poorly. I certainly think it was communicated poorly. There was a terrible PR strategy from the get-go, led from the very top by Albo, constantly going on about feels, failing to even read the Uluru Statement of the Heart, as Baring pointed out the other day, and then telling people, why would I? Why would I read it? But if you don't know, go and find out, or you're a dinosaur or dickhead. Just like base level, like grade school sort of communications mistakes, in my opinion. And then we've got the yes supporters who believe that most of the information that's come from the no campaign is a crock of shit. They don't think there's pretty much any valid reason to vote no. As Lorena Allen pointed out, they believe it was a poll on their right to exist in their own country. Where is it? Deeply hurt. Referendum became by proxy a vote on Indigenous people's right to exist in our own land. If that is true, they saw the referendum as something that it just wasn't from the very beginning. They saw it as something else entirely, and I can understand why many would see it as a vote on their, maybe not their right to exist, but on their validity in the political system. But the unfortunate fact is that's just not what it was. This was nothing but a decision on whether or not to include an Indigenous advisory body in the Constitution. That's it. They both have very different ideas of what the vote means. Oh, we got JJ, of course. I forgot to read him out. Australia is the only first world country that doesn't recognise its Indigenous people in its constitution. True. And if the referendum was just about recognition, it would have passed with flying colours. I have no doubt whatsoever. 80, 85, 90% support. Tie that to another advisory body, another proposal entirely. Try to lock that into the Constitution so it can't be shut down or modified at its core if it pulls another ATSIC. And you're asking a fundamentally different question. But look at that. What a racist shithole. I think I may have said that yesterday, but I was only joking. Peter Murphy. This analysis from Michelle Grattan could have been written by Peter Credlin. It's all Albo's fault? No, can't be. No mention of Dutton's fear-mongering, lies and disinformation. Disinformation is a word you are going to see a lot more of from the Albo government. It's going to get scary. It's going to be much more scary than anything the Voice would or would not have done had it been locked into the Constitution. Let's have a look at what Michelle Grattan's actually saying. If the Voice is defeated on Saturday, it will be a devastating rebuff for the Prime Minister. He'll have raised Indigenous hopes only to see them dashed. He'll have led Australians on an arduous journey, only to have them desert him before the destination. Apparently, that statement of just observing reality like that is so unthinkable that it's come from the Sky News After Dark right-wing crowd. It's not all Albo's fault, but a goddamn sizable portion of it is. Dutton's fear-mongering and lies, / disinformation, whatever you want to call it, that was baked in, and I don't think that moved the needle a great deal. And the news media. Now we've got to crack down on the news media. But Michelle Grattan is no right-winger. She is a progressive, fairly progressive political pundit, maybe more neoliberal, but she writes for The Age. She's not spouting off racist tropes in the right-wing rag. But any acknowledgement of the no side, just something breaks in people's brains. They can't even imagine it. Dutton destroyed the voice to Parliament, so it's only fair to destroy Dutton's political career as a goodwill gesture of reciprocation. All right, that's pretty good. I don't have a problem with destroying Dutton's political career either. He's had a fairly long one. He's very conservative. I believe he'll drag the Liberal Party quite a bit further to the conservative right rather than the liberal centre. So, go nuts, Eddie. Go nuts. You have my blessing. And finally, I don't know if Malcolm Roberts lives in Queensland. Yes, Malcolm Roberts, Queensland. Obviously, Queensland, the home of One Nation. On Saturday, over 60% of Australians realised that they are the masters of the government, not servants to the government. I don't know if anyone thought that deeply about it. Maybe some people in your neck of the woods did. I spoke this morning on the Voice to Parliament, which saw 5 electorates with the largest Aboriginal population give the Voice a thrashing. Electorates. Citation needed. We'll have to go back to the Guardian article to dive further into that, to zoom in on the national map, but I'm not going to do that now. Australia voted no to feelings-based governance. That is true. And no to elevating one group within our community over all others based only on skin colour. That's not true, because it's not based on skin colour. I mean, are you going to tell me it's based on skin colour? I don't think so, mate. I think you're having a bit of a lend there, screaming into the void. Saturday's result clearly shows Canberra no longer represents the values and beliefs of everyday Australians. Possibly true. It's time to dismantle the Canberra Aboriginal industry and deliver resources directly to those in need in the bush. Well, I'm sure Albo's all ears, mate. Maybe if you have a proposal to put forward. It's time to stop preventing rural Aboriginals from owning their own homes and running their own affairs. That is an interesting juxtaposition with supporting the No campaign for a voice to Parliament. But it's a One Nation senator from Queensland, so not a huge shock there from Malcolm Roberts. Oh, okay. We've covered just about all we can on the voice to Parliament. I was going to move on to the Israel-Palestine conflict and see if we can answer a couple of questions, like whether Hamas qualifies as a terrorist organization or whether Israel qualifies as an apartheid state, as both claims that I've heard a lot in the last week. But I think it might be a bit late for that, so I might pick that up tomorrow. Cheers for hanging out. Peace.